The battle lines are drawn: high carb versus low carb fueling for endurance performance. Which diet comes out on top? Which one could be holding you back? Should you load up with 120 grams of carbs per hour, or should you drip feed yourself just 50 grams of carbs per hour? Unfortunately, endurance nutrition pundits have fallen into one of two camps in the past few years. The carbs are king camp, or the carbs are the enemy camp, gaining massive followings in the process, but confusing the hell out of endurance athletes. We at MOTTIV don't fall into either camp. We are in the camp of giving you the best information that will make you the best version of yourself in whatever races you want to take on, no matter whether you're a total beginner or a world-class age grouper. Let's settle this debate so you know what's right for you and your unique body and goals. MOTTIV CEO Taren Gazelle started at 215 pounds and became a top 1% triathlete in the world and a record-setting marathon swimmer. He wrote Triathlon Nutrition Foundations as the framework for how endurance athletes should fuel. And resident MOTTIV sports scientist Nick Jankovskis will explain the science behind how you should fuel. Let's start with Taren. Taren, why are equally smart endurance coaches saying such different things, with some of them claiming that people need 120 grams of carbs an hour, while others are saying about less than half of that?
I think they're talking about the same thing, but for different people. And all of us regular endurance athletes are getting lost in the process. So I've done the research on this, and we've actually built a nutrition calculator on MyMOTTIV.com. And just for example, to illustrate what we're talking about, we take a half Ironman and you punch in the amount of time that you think a half Ironman is going to take, the weight of an individual, and you can get the rough calories that the person would burn and the amount of calories that they would consume. Now, for the average pro who's doing this in 3 hours and 45 minutes, weighs 155 pounds, they need 1,300 calories that they have to consume. Now, if we take an average amateur who's doing this weighing 170 pounds and in 5 hours and 40 minutes, still a very fast time, it's only 1,048 calories. So we're talking about fewer calories to cover the same distance. And when you start dividing it up by the amount of hours that they're on the course, the pro athlete who's going really, really fast, yeah, of course, they are going to need a lot more fuel. The average endurance athlete, they're going to need a lot less fuel because they aren't working nearly as hard. And I think what's happening is people are talking about pros almost as if that's what everyone should do. Or they're talking about the average amateur as if that's what everyone should do. And not talking about the nuance that goes into it. And really the nuance is like, how fast are you going? How much do you weigh? How much fat and carbs do you burn as fuel? And this all comes down to different numbers for different people. But what's happening is the pundits are out there saying 120 is better, more is always better, or 90 is the number, or 60 is the number. And it's really nice to put our thought processes into these really easy to understand frameworks like, oh, if I just have 60 per hour, I'll be good. Or if I'll just have 90 per hour, I'll be good. But that's not how it works. There's a lot of nuance that goes into it. It's fairly straightforward once you understand it. But when you have all of these different pundits talking about different things as if one single number is the answer that everyone should follow, it just confuses the hell out of everyone.
But if you look on your nutrition packages, it will tell you how much per hour of that thing that you should consume while you're racing. So are the nutrition packages wrong too?
I think they're also oversimplifying it, yes.
Okay. So Nick, then what would the science say? Does that confirm what Taren says, or is he wrong?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think the more nuanced you go, it's around, well, the individual's going to be different. So a pro athlete is going to be expending a lot of calories, a lot of carbohydrate. They're also working at really high intensity, but then the interesting dynamic is they're racing for much shorter periods of time because their race is quicker. So do they need to take more per hour? In a lot of cases, yes. But then also in some events, you look at like an elite marathon, some of them are taking very minimal amounts of fuel comparative to an age group up who might take 2 hours longer to complete that same event. So I think the individual characteristics of this are, well, what intensity are you working at relative to yourself? And then what does that mean for how long you're going to be out there on course? Also then factor in, and this is something we test in the lab, is, well, we've got individual nuances on how much fat and carbohydrate we each burn at each different intensity. So a similar amateur athlete at the same pace on race day could actually be burning more or less than the person standing next to them, who could be a clone of themselves. So there's this subtle difference that we need to factor in for. You get pretty close with some general theory and characteristics, but there is a bit of individualization that needs to go into it, which is where these blanket rules of everyone needs to use the same can't really work.
So Nick, would a person, like if I ran race A and then ran race B, does that even mean I'm going to need a different amount of carbs in race A than I am going to need in race B?
Define what race A and race B is. I mean, if we take a race A being a very steady state event, so same intensity over a couple of hours, there's going to be likely a much lesser need for carbohydrate comparative to if we take an event that's very intermittent in nature. So what I mean by that is you think about road cycling's a great example. Some days out on a stage, it might be the same continuous intensity in the peloton. You're rolling along. There's not much change of intensity. It's very constant. So that's going to change the characteristic of the event versus we get a road race that has lots of changes or surges, people going off the front, trying to catch up into breakaways. We get this really dynamic or intermittent nature. These rapid changes in intensity then increase the carbohydrate demand. So now we're talking about some very different things, even within the same sport and what on paper might look like the same event. Is it uphill? Is it flat? Uphill, you're going to be working harder up gradients over longer periods of time than you are going to be on the flat. Was there wind involved? So there's a lot of factors that even between race A, race B, it might be the same in theory on paper, same kilometers, distance, etc. But the dynamics of each of those can play out very, very differently in terms of your fueling requirement.
So this sounds complicated to figure out. Taren, is this something that is complicated to figure out?
I think that it's complicated to figure out if you want to make it complicated to figure out. If you need to get down to the level of Nick's athletes where we're talking about 0.1% might make the difference between getting to a world championship or an Olympics and not, yeah, you have to start going into this huge amount of nuance. I think that for the average amateur, we really just need to figure out a couple of things. Number one is how fast are we going and how much do we weigh, which are fairly known-ish things. If you've raced before, you have an idea of what your time is going to be. And from that, you can get at least a reasonably accurate guesstimate of what calorie expenditure you are going to go through. And then we use the science of Dr. John Ivey, who has studied nutrition, periodization, and combustion and requirements, and literally wrote the book on how much we need to fuel. And what he says is, as a guideline, largely because our stomach has only about 20 to 30% of the blood flow that it normally has, you take about 25% of the calories that you are combusting. So if over the course of a half Ironman, you're going to burn 4,000 calories, well, a rule of thumb is try to replace around 1,000 calories. And for the average amateur, tends to be pretty close. You just dose that out over the course of the race in reasonably even increments, and you're going to get close. At very least, it'll give you a starting point to start utilizing this target in your training. If you're tired and bonking by the end of the training workout, you probably need a little bit more. If you're feeling a little bit burpy, you need a little bit less. And this is how you start finding out your unique exact number. Maybe it's 60 an hour, maybe it's 50 an hour, maybe it's 40 an hour, maybe it is 90 an hour, but at least you have a starting point for you instead of just reading some label or listening to somebody who says 90 is what you need and thinking that's the actual answer.
So you said you're going to start to figure out your own individual number. Presumably the idea is that you're going to start to do that in training. But if you're only training for this amount of time, but you're going to be racing for this amount of time, how do you actually figure that out?
That sounds like really terrible training for me. Your training in the last 3 months before a race should start mimicking that race more and more and more. Almost to the point that by the time you get to a race, whatever it might be, you don't really look at the race as much of a challenge. So if we're talking about our half marathon training plans, well, there are going to be some runs that are 25 kilometers long. So you're going to get a run where you're out there on your feet for a really long time with your stomach jostling. If we're talking about half Ironman training, there are going to be some workouts where you're out on a bike for even longer than you will be for the actual race day, and then you'll do a run after. So you get workouts that are very similar to a race, not entirely at race intensity for the whole amount of distance, but you get little glimpses of what race day is going to be like. And if you're practicing your nutrition in the 12 weeks leading up to a race, you get a reasonably good look at like how much is enough or how much is too much.
Nick, then if what Taren is describing is sounds like actually a fairly reasonably easy way to start figuring out how much you need in a race, why would you say that we're hearing from top coaches or top pundits, as Taren has called them, saying, well, you only need 60 an hour or you need 120 an hour, and that's the pat answer? Why do you think we have this sort of blanket statement being made when clearly everybody is different?
I think for the most part, it's throw enough darts at the wall, a couple will stick. I think sometimes we can get a bit into that mode of coaches finding something that works for a handful of athletes and then trying to apply it on, because, I mean, it makes sense. We test a theory, it does work a few times, we want to try and reuse it. And then as Taren mentioned before, the other component is, well, we're constantly looking at, well, what are the best in the world doing? And how can we replicate that or take something from that? And so we've seen over the years, and there was a great study over a number of Ironmans of Kona or World Championships where you saw, and it gets brought up all the time, you see the feeding strategies and relative to their times. And it was essentially a pretty good correlation between more carbohydrate intake and faster race time. And so I think a simple study like that then plays into, okay, the screenshot of the graph gets shared, everyone looks at it and goes, more carbs, faster time, let's do that. When we're not then considering, well, what is the impact of that? What are you racing 7.5, 8 hours like those pros in that research study, or are you racing over 12 hours? Like, we're talking very, very different sets of physiology. So I think a lot of it largely gets lost in, there's some numbers that we pull from bits and pieces, and we hear things from all different sources, and we try and combine that all into one and go, oh, we heard 60 grams an hour somewhere, so I'm going to use that. It's not understanding where that number comes from and applying it in the way it was intended to be applied. It's sort of taking that and going, that's a number that someone talked about, so we're going to use that. I think that's where it can get lost a little bit.
Why would smart people, and presuming some of these really high-end coaches are smart people, why would they make a blanket statement knowing that amateurs are very different than pros?
I think a lot of it's like, sometimes you just don't have enough information, or in particular from a research perspective, the interesting thing in a lot of nutrition studies, and this might sound a bit controversial, is like most of them are backed by nutrition companies. That at some point you need to fund your research, right? So a great example is we've seen over a number of years, a lot of the hydration research has been done by the Gatorade Institute. Like, I mean, there's going to be a commercial link there. So it's one that if you're a coach a lot of coaches in the industry are fantastic coaches, but they may not be sports scientists. Like, we're seeing a lot more of a link now, but it's the type of thing that if you haven't come from a physiology, science sort of background, you don't have that formal education and training in that space, and you're trying to work out where to draw your information from, you might be missing some of those critical points in terms of how to assess and analyze that information. But then also, like I said, a lot of it then comes down to, well, we've heard or we've seen these high-performing athletes use something, so let's try and implement it. And whether it's right or wrong, they might have success in some circumstances, but sometimes if it doesn't work, like we never hear about the things that don't work necessarily. So you take 120 grams an hour because that's what the pros are doing, and you apply it to your 45-year-old amateur athlete, and it did work. Well, no one's putting that on social media necessarily to say it didn't work. So I think a lot of the times it's like some of these principles get a bit of trial by error almost, and then we get to a result. But I think a lot of these coaches aren't necessarily making really dumb decisions. They're just trialing things and then telling us about the ones that worked, and then maybe getting a bit lost in not understanding why it worked.
So Taren, sorry, you mentioned too little and you bonk, and bonk for the uninitiated means you fall apart, basically. You stop. You can't keep going. Your body just bonks. But too much and you get burpee. Is burpee the worst outcome from eating too many? Because it seems like, wouldn't it be better to have too much on board than not enough on board? Too much seems like you could deal with it.
Well, Nick actually talked about that one study where they looked at, does additional carbs improve race performance? And the answer was yes. I don't know if it was the same study or if it was a different study, but I've heard that they also looked at the number one reason that people threw up in a race and DNF'd in a race, and it was from throwing up and having too many carbs. So right in line with increased performance of additional carbs, there was also an increased incidence of barfing and not actually finishing. So I come back to, if you are only the person that needs 1,000 over the course of 5 hours and 40 minutes, as opposed to 1,300 over 3 hours and 45 minutes, and you don't need that 90, 100, 110 grams per hour rate, why risk it? Like, why would you even play that game of chicken? Because yes, there's potential that you could get faster. Nobody's guaranteeing that you have additional carbs and it makes you faster. There's only potential that it makes you faster, but there's equal potential that you're throwing up and not even finishing the race. I would say, why not try to get an appropriate amount of carbs? And if you think, like, we're talking about 120 grams of carbs, multiply that by 480 calories. That's a meal for most people. And they're talking about consuming a meal every single hour while we're racing. Like, if I said you have to go and eat 480 calories every single hour. No, if I even said it, you have to eat 480 calories every single hour while you're sitting on the couch, you'd be like, oh my God, that's so much. And people are recommending that you do it in a race while you're running. It just starts getting really, really hard, and the juice isn't worth the squeeze.
Okay, so we want to find the right amount. That's really important. More isn't more, and less isn't more. The right amount is what's the right amount. But then you're talking about carbs and how many carbs you should eat. But we also hear a lot about low-carb athletes and low-carb training, low-carb fueling, that you shouldn't be taking carbs, you should be taking protein and fat. So I'm not sure which of the two of you should start this conversation, but there's people in both of those camps that you should be in the low-carb diet or you should be eating croissants all day long to make sure you are fueled right up to the top with carbs. Which camp is right? Because they are warring factions. They do not agree with each other. Nick, you go first. Oh, Taren? Okay.
My experience with Dr. Dan Plews, who talks about this a lot, and he definitely falls more on the 50 to 60 grams of carbs per hour.
Would that be considered low?
Well, yeah, consuming 50 to 60 grams of carbs per hour in a race, absolutely, very, very low. And he was a big proponent of controlling your carbs so you burn more fat as fuel. Something that people should understand is when you're hearing that from somebody like Dan Plews, who is such a big proponent of burning as much fat as you possibly can in a race, you have more access to energy. If you can burn more fat, you have more fat that is burning every single minute, so you have additional calories that are coming into your body to fuel the system, so you might not need as many carbs. Now, if you are somebody that eats a very, very carb-heavy diet, where it's typically a traditional Western diet, where it's croissants, it's gels, it's sports nutrition products, you're not going to really burn a full hell of a lot of fat, so you probably need actually additional carbs because you're not getting all of that energy that you might need from fat. So there's nuance there as well. That's why I say in training, start with a number that is roughly right for a lot of people and then start dialing it down. If you're having too much, well, you're going to be burping and you probably need to have a little bit less. If you are feeling fatigued, you can probably try a little bit more. There's the nuance there. So yeah, like it comes down to what are you eating day to day? And that then relates to what you're doing in a race.
Okay, so Nick, what do you think about the points Taren made there? Do you agree with that? Does science agree with that?
Yeah, so I think there's a few 101 physiology things we need to understand first. Like our two major food fuels that we're going to use in activity are be fats and carbs. They're going to give us a lot of energy across endurance events. We're going to use a combination of both. I think the interesting thing with fat as a fuel source is that it gives us a lot of energy and we're realistically not going to run out of it. Like a lean 70 kilo male, which is a pretty typical lean endurance athlete, is going to have more than enough fat to get through most, if not all, events. And you're not going to have to consume fat. So far in this discussion, we haven't talked about consuming fat during a race. We've talked about consuming carbs. And that's because we're not going to run out of our fat store. It's going to take you 2 weeks out in the middle of nowhere, survival type mode, to run out of fat. Carbohydrate, we've got about 90 minutes.
And by fat, sorry, just to be clear, fat, you mean body fat, like
body fat. Yeah,
of the arm, whatever, however you want to.
Yeah,
the body fat that you're carrying.
Yeah, so our body stores it because it's a quite useful fuel source for what we're doing right now. We're sitting down. We're at a very, very, very low intensity, if not resting. We're going to need some energy to keep us awake and moving. So we're going to utilize fat predominantly at a very low intensity. If I get up and go for a walk down and get a coffee, I'm going to largely be using fat because the energy requirement isn't massive, but also we don't need the energy really rapidly or quickly. So the distinction here is we use carbohydrate when we need the energy more quickly because it's a more economical, it's an easier fuel to access. And what I mean by economical is oxygen consumption. So how much oxygen is actually required to break down or burn, if you like, a carbohydrate molecule versus a fat molecule, significantly less for carbohydrate. So it's actually a much more effective way of getting that energy. But the caveat being, we don't have an endless supply of carbohydrate. So this is this balance that we need to make is, for some people, in theory, it's like, yeah, if we can use more fat and delay or spare, if you like, the amount of carbohydrate we've got, in theory, it should make more sense. But depending what the intensity is like and the duration of the race and the dynamics of the race, it then might be a limiting factor because if we can't access it as quickly because it requires significantly more oxygen to break down, which is going to mean significantly more time to get the energy we need to push through the pedals and output, that's probably going to slow us down and limit or restrict the intensity we can work at.
And to clarify something, Nick, you talk about an endless source. What about super lean people who don't have a lot of body fat? That, to me, doesn't seem like an endless source. Or is there more that the body can draw from that we just don't sort of perceive?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, take a 70 kilo lean male. You could probably survive about a week and a half to 2 weeks if you didn't have anything out in the wilderness. So this is the kind of amount of fat store we're talking about, even in someone who's very, very lean.
Like 40,000 available calories, right? On board, basically.
And so that's an important thing to understand. We're not just talking people who might have a bit more body fat. It's someone who's very lean, 8%, 9% body fat, is still going to have a massive amount of fat to utilize. We just don't want to have to go all the way through it because at some point we need to keep some on us. So from a survival aspect, we could last a long time. In a race circumstance, you're not going to run out of fat in a racing circumstance.
Does this mean you agree with a lower carb approach, or is that what I'm hearing from you? Like, can you clear that up a little, I guess?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing with exercise intensity is that from about 60-65% of your peak oxygen consumption, so take your VO2 max, roll it back down 60-65%, that's kind of our tipping point for where most people are going to see more of a carbohydrate utilization than a fat utilization. We'll still have some, but let's say if we want to use very simplified numbers here, it's at some point we're going to be more fat than carb. As intensity increases, we get to about 50-50, which most people are familiar with. The term, say, a crossover effect is what we call it. A 50% fat contribution, 50% carb contribution. Once we get to about 60 or 65% of our maximal aerobic ability, so that VO2 max, is where we're going to have more of a contribution from carbohydrate. The interesting thing with that number specifically, though, for most people, and I've tested a lot of people in the lab, things like marathon running, we take that as an example, is probably going to sit about 70-75% of VO2 max for a lot of amateurs. So now we're looking at an intensity that we're going to have to rely slightly more on carbohydrate than fat. So I start arguing it's like a very, very low carbohydrate approach, probably not the best. A managed or a slightly higher carbohydrate intake, probably a bit better idea. Super high carb though, going aggressively the other way, it's not like a marathon, probably not the right idea. So it still then manages in what that individual needs based on that intensity.
I would like to just kind of put some easy frameworks on this because we're really getting into the weeds, and also kind of getting into that point of the crossover between, all right, race nutrition versus day-to-day nutrition. And the understanding that I used to have is that if you are a carbs kind of person, maybe you can burn 0.4 grams of fat per minute of exercise. Quite low. I've heard of people getting up close to the 1.5, 1.6 grams of fat per minute of exercise. And yes, while Nick is saying that it's far less efficient, so let's say you have like, what is it? Is it 30 or 40% more energy to burn fat as fuel than carbs?
From an efficiency perspective, we actually get significantly more energy from 1 gram of fat than we would 1 gram of carbohydrate, because it's a much more complex molecule and will completely break down. So the efficiency side is better, but the economy to get that requires way more oxygen to get through that process, and therefore it takes a bit longer. And also it's just like we're going to have to ultimately take in more air, transport more oxygen, and try and use more oxygen to get the same output. So if you took the same energy requirement and recalculated back the other way to get the equivalent carbon fat to give you that, you'd need more oxygen for the fat component than you would for the carbohydrate component.
Yeah, exactly. So you need more energy, more oxygen, more. You're going to be pedantic, I know, but I'm just simplifying it. You need to put more in to get out from the fat than you do from carbs. However, you can get 3-4 times more energy because fat molecules are very, very dense, and you can increase the amount of fat that you can burn. All I'm getting at with that is that in our workouts, in our training plans, what we do is for the very, very low intensity workouts, the recovery runs, the recovery rides, the recovery swims, the long runs where there's no intervals whatsoever, we say, like, keep your carbs low. Just maybe have berries, unripe bananas, maybe some oatmeal, like keep that blood sugar in check. So you give your body at least a chance to learn how to burn fat as fuel a little bit better. And all we're trying to do is just give you a bit of a buffer. So I'm not saying go low carb. I'm saying for the odd workout here or there where you don't have any intervals, if you just keep your blood sugar in check by eating primarily proteins, fats, and then low blood sugar fruits or vegetables, all of a sudden you're going to be able to access both energy stores. You can burn those carbs really, really easily like Nick is talking, and maybe burn a little bit more fat as fuel, just giving you that buffer so you don't have so much to make up for on race day, which gets away for us age group amateurs who are going at a much slower pace, gets away from having to consume so many carbs because we're not working nearly as hard. For somebody who's doing that 3-hour, 45-minute half Ironman, they are way into the carb burning zone, and they're almost exclusively burning carbs and can only use carbs as fuel. But for us who are going at a steadier pace, we can actually access that fat, which gives us almost a leg up because we don't have to risk the 90, 100, 110 grams to make up for the shortfall that we're actually experiencing.
Nick, I know that was not pedantic enough for you, but was it correct?
I like where that's going a lot more. We talk about this concept of like periodized carbohydrate. So it's almost similar to looking at your training week. And I think the points Taren made there around, you still need to give yourself some carbohydrate availability in the week, because we need all of our fuels at different times. But if you're going and doing a hard, high intensity interval session midweek, you're going to need some carbohydrate. But if you're going out for a 45, 60 minute, very easy zone 1, zone 2 type effort, you can probably get away with slightly less carbohydrate. You don't need to go and take 15 gels and load up on heaps of carbs before the session. Like, you can manipulate this in a way, and I think that's probably the more practical theory longer term, is this notion of managing your fuel intake around the needs that you've got. and periodizing it and structuring it like you would your training sessions. You periodize and structure your training sessions rather than being really aggressively in one camp all the time or the other. I mean, there's moments where high carbohydrate is going to make more sense. There's moments where lower carbohydrate is probably going to make more sense. Like, why not manipulate it to give us a bit of both to get the maximum adaptation than just being like, oh, I'm a low carb person, so I'm going to go out and do my Ironman and not take anything and hope for the best. It's like, well, we know that's probably not the best way to go about it. And I know a lot of the big low carb proponents would probably agree to an extent with that. They might not be the 120 gram an hour, but they're still providing some carbohydrate to their athletes to get through those events. So this notion of being one or the other is probably the biggest issue in this debate, rather than like, let's try and take the best of some of those either end approaches and find a good middle ground that's going to give you the best for what you need week in, week out, but then on race day as well.
But why are you hearing some top coaches in the professional ranks of triathlon, for example, saying, we've figured it out now, it's got to be carbs, we got to give our guys more carbs, when they have access to all of the research and the testing methods and everything else? So if they're saying it, and again, I know we talked about this at the beginning, that just because it is right for pros doesn't mean it's right for everybody, but you've got some smart minds who are saying, nope, low carb was wrong, now we must have high carb. Like, how does anybody know what to believe?
Completely survivorship bias. There are so many coaches out there that I've heard of that when you talk to ex-athletes of theirs, they say that is not a good coach. They're just somebody who made a name for themselves, and every year they get 50 new people that show up on their doorstep waiting for them to be their coach. They break 49 of them, and one of them is somehow the unicorn that does well. Does that make them a good coach because they turned one into a unicorn that became a world championship? Or is it a bad coach because 98% of their athletes broke and are potentially out of the sport? I'd say for age groupers, listening to people who break 98% of their athletes, probably not somebody that you want to listen to. There's that same survivorship bias where if you throw 120 grams of carbs at 10 of your athletes, 9 of them puke and 1 of them wins a race, well, you get to do the Instagram post that says so-and-so's nutrition strategy was 120 grams of carbs. Pay no attention to these 9 people over here that barfed.
Okay, so we actually, one of you touched on this really briefly earlier, the idea that the length of your exercising or the length of your race is going to also determine somewhat of how much you have to take in. So what if you're a 5K runner or you're a marathon runner? I mean, that obviously is quite different. So how is that going to look different for athletes depending on what they're doing?
I think a really good place to start with this is, well, how much carbohydrate availability do we have? Most people, it's about 90 minutes. So you've got about 90 minutes worth of stored carbohydrate in your system that without topping anything up, you can get by on. So that means for the most part, events 60 minutes and less, 75 minutes and less, you're probably not going to need to take anything at all. Or if you're going to take something, it's a very small amount. It might be something as simple as some really interesting research into what we call mouth rinsing, carbohydrate mouth rinsing. Tip some Gatorade into your mouth, swirl it around for about 15 seconds, and then you can spit it out. And we actually get a bit of an effect similar to if you actually ingested it. Like there's a response through the brain that's going to sort of release a bit of carbohydrate for you. So it's a really interesting one to just give you a little bit of something. It's not going to give you heaps of carbohydrate. It's not going to replace things. So when we talk about longer events, you can't get away with carbohydrate rinsing. If we're doing something an hour to 2.5 hours, yeah, we're going to need to start ingesting a little bit of carbohydrate and actually consuming it.
Does carbohydrate rinsing work with food? Like if you chewed up a banana and then spit that banana out, is that the same thing? You're not rinsing exactly, but does it work with solids or just liquids?
Probably wouldn't try it. It probably would be pretty ordinary to get through. Most of the research has been in liquids. So that's what, like, you use something like a Gatorade or a drink mix is probably the preferred method because it's easier, but it also is just simple and quick. Versus trying to get a solid. So yeah, stick on the liquids if you're going to do any mouth rinsing.
I don't know. I could chew up a banana and spit it out. I don't think that's hard. It's fine. But anyway,
are you talking about like a weighted diet? You know, just rinse a banana 5 times a day and have a sensible dinner.
For clarity, we're strictly talking during a running event. Yeah. Don't need to be walking down the street spitting out your cup of carbohydrate.
Anyway, sorry, Nick, I interrupted you. Continue.
Yeah, so that's obviously for very short distance events. Or if you're a 5K runner, realistically, don't take anything. If you're a 10K runner and you're running sort of sub 60 minutes, again, you're probably not going to need anything as long as you have topped yourself up, like pretty typically. You don't have to carbohydrate load. Just make sure you've had some carbs in the day leading into that 5K event. If they're looking slightly longer, so now we go to things that are an hour to 2.5 hours, is kind of our next time banding. So we're now talking about, for a lot of amateurs, we're starting to get into half marathon territory, starting to get into like Olympic distance triathlon distance. 30 to 60 for most people is probably okay in that time frame because we're getting through a lot of that event on our storage capacity. It's about that 90 odd minutes we get through, but we're going a little bit longer, so we're going to need a little bit of top up here and there, which is why if you speak or look at most amateur Olympic distance triathletes, they start incorporating things like gels, not many, a couple of gels and maybe a bit of like a drink mix in an Olympic distance, but they'll race a sprint distance race on nothing. It's like that 1 versus 2 hour type difference. When we're now talking about 2 hour plus or 2.5 hour plus in particular, your half Ironman, your marathon for most of us other than the really, really elite in the world, your Ironman distance, etc. Now we're heading into that category of 60 to 90 has very much been the main recommendation for a long, long period of time now. But now we're starting to see this excessive intake of 110, 120, rumors of 140 plus in the pro ranks. But we're now talking about a very different scenario where 90 minutes of stored carbohydrates isn't going to cut it when our event goes for 4 hours, 5 hours, 10 hours. We're going to have to top up pretty significantly to keep on top of that before we bonk, or we like calling it hitting the wall. It's like you're getting to a point where you've run out of carbohydrate, we haven't put enough back in. At some point, things are going to start slipping, and namely, that's going to be exercise intensity. So now we hit the wall, you bonk, we go food flat, however you want to describe it. You're going to start slowing down if you run out of carbs. So much more critical when we talk about these much longer events. Short distance, if you're doing a 5K, don't try and take 120 grams of carbs during a 25-minute 5K, please.
Taren, have you seen, from a real life standpoint, people chowing down on stuff on really short races when they shouldn't be?
Yeah, I've seen that all the time, that you see 5K, 10K runners that have the race belts with all of their nutrition on it as if they're going for a moving buffet. Whereas I was pretty much exactly what Nick talked about for a sprint race, that friends and I, who were all racing anywhere from about 102 to 106 in a sprint race, we'd actually dump half of our bottle before the race because apparently that quarter of a pound might have made a difference out on the bike. And we'd just take a swish at the end of the bike and maybe a rinse on the run. And exactly the same sort of thing in an Olympic. Like, we started thinking about, okay, maybe I'll fit in a gel, maybe I'll take one just in case I start bonking a little bit and need that neurological refresh that swishing some carbohydrates or something really sticky and gooey and very tasty gets you. So maybe you'd take that for an Olympic. But again, that was us doing anywhere from 201 to 211 kind of races. For the people that are out there for 3 hours, all of a sudden you have to start thinking about it. So the rules of thumb that I always recommend is 75 to 90 minutes and under. You probably don't really have to worry about much because you're starting with 2,000 to 2,500 calories on board in your liver and your muscles right at the start line. You're good. After that, yeah, exactly what Nick said. In that Olympic, that like 1.5 to 3 hour range, you do have to take quite a bit less because you're getting through most of it with whatever you started with on board. After that, that's where I would say start with our nutrition calculator. You can use it for triathlons, swimming, cycling, like every distance race of triathlon, and you can get that starting point that is unique to you.
And we'll have that calculator.
Just Google MOTTIV Nutrition Calculator. First thing that pops up will be there. It's free to use. You punch in your weight, the amount of distance or time that you're doing it, and it all works out based on your pace and your weight. And then start trial and error, in the 12 weeks leading up to a race, testing what that nutrition calculator gave you per hour, and then start customizing. If you're tired, try to take a little bit more. If you're hungry, take a little bit more. If you're burping, take a little bit less. And it gets you pretty well dialed in.
Obviously, the calculator would take into account that stuff and give you the output. But just for the sense of it, would somebody heavier probably need more grams or less grams? What is the calculator going to spit out?
Yeah, so, I mean, even in that case, I mean, if we look at potentially equal storage, the thing that person's potentially going to have to overcome is the economy component. So if we're looking at running, much greater energy cost in terms of running when you've got more mass on you. So take someone who's 100 kilos versus someone who's 70 kilos. They're going to have to output more energy to overcome that mass because there's more resistance. It's like running with a backpack on, right? So if we're having to output more energy, it's going to cost them a lot more in terms of carbohydrate to produce that same output because it's just not as economical. The counter component to that is if you've got someone who's heavier, potentially because of that energy requirement, we're now not going to be moving as quick of a speed, possibly. And that's a pretty likely scenario. Very rare to see really elite marathon runners at 100 kilos. Like most of them are so sub 60. So this back and forth in terms of the economy and energy cost is really going to play into how much fuel you're going to need. It's really going to play into the intensity aspect. As a result, if your intensity has to drop to be more sustainable for, say, a marathon, well, maybe that's going to change your fat versus carbohydrate demand, and ultimately we're going to need a pretty moderate amount still. So you can definitely see across very different weighted athletes some similar requirements, but this is again that complex interaction of your fitness level, your training history, how well you utilize carbs and fats as fuel, the length of the event. There's so many individual characteristics that can play into it. I definitely sit in that nuance space. But you can then also come out and go, well, we have a 100 kilo and a 70 kilo that in some circumstances with their characteristics might then be taking similar amounts of carb. We might get a slightly different race result sometimes, but you might get some similarities there in terms of what they're actually utilizing for them because of those little individual differences.
Yeah, bang on. I just actually did the nutrition calculator for two different people that are running the same 4-hour marathon. I don't know what Nick is talking about with kilos, but I tried to calculate that into what us North Americans talk about. But we did a 75 kilo 4-hour marathoner, burned, according to John Ivey's research, which our calculator is based on, 2,218 calories, whereas the heavier athlete 3,168. So yes, because you're traveling the same distance and you have to push more mass over that same distance, you're going to have to work harder, take a little bit more. But we're not talking about going from like 60 grams of carbs to 140 grams of carbs just because you have some extra pounds.
And I think that is kind of the size of it with this topic of conversation. I know we're going to discuss in different podcasts exactly what that fuel should be made up of, what foods should you be thinking about eating, the composition of those foods as far as the molecules that they're made up of, different variations of things, combinations, singles, whatever, and a broad variety of other topics. But for now, I think we have hit the bell on high carb, low carb, and the bottom line is it's different for everybody, and there isn't one camp that's correct. Well, Nick, if people want to look you up and see the kind of work you're doing, where can they find you?
Yeah, so you can find me at the METS lab here in Melbourne, so METS Performance. You can look that up on most social medias, or individually, my initials NJ Sports Science. Generally can find me pretty easily with that on, again, most platforms.
And Taren, where can everybody find you?
You can check us out at MOTTIV. I'm here. Go to MyMOTTIV.com, MyMOTTIV.com, where our training plans are free for people to use. And related to everything that we talked about here, if people using our app simply put in their weight into the app, every single workout will have a recommendation of should it be a lower carb, a blood glucose controlled workout to try to burn more fat, or a high carb so that you have all of the energy on board that you need. And on race-specific workouts, it'll give a target that uses our calculations with really what you should be trying to hit. So everything that we talked about here is taken into account. It's just inserted right into the workout. So little plug for our app.
All right. Thank you guys for this, and we will see you next time.